studying it since 1993 when the Philippines abrogated the US bases.
Oh,
in
yes,
Finland.
yes, yes.
And my question really is dealing directly with China's military ambition.
Yes.
In 2050, they aim to have a military that fights and wins.
Yes.
That's kind of disturbing when you're considering their gradual encroachment into the 9-dash
Yes,
line.
yes.
But I see two possible paths of peace, given what happened to Japan as well. It transformed it from a military country to a pacifist one. One is the Falun Gong. I think the world should support the Falun Gong. That's a peace movement. Well, that's your opinion. The second is, I think Hong Kong is giving a good sends a good signal to the rest of the world that they've got to fight for the right.
Yes. Yes.
But the third is, embedded within the two Chinas, Taiwan and the People's Republic of China, is Sun Yat-sen. A return, a revival, a renaissance
Yes.
into the philosophy
Yes.
and economic framework of Dr. Sun Yat-sen.
Yes, yes.
Both Chinas respect it, and if we express a great interest in it and encourage it within China, I think that will head towards a path of peace.
Yes.
I'm interested in Sun Yat-sen myself because I'm a Georgist,
Uh-huh.
and so was Sun Yat-sen. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not that optimistic, I'm afraid. I mean, the first point just to make is that China's military developments are absolutely in step with, an important part of the broader trend in the growth of Chinese power and influence. But it is also worth noting that some significant features of the way the Chinese have done that. They are, of course, always have been a huge continental power. And they've got, actually the army is much smaller than it used to be, but it's still a very big army. But what matters to Australia, and for that matter to the Philippines, is to what extent it's a maritime power. And one of the really important developments over the last, 20 or 25 years in particular, really since 1996 in fact, is that China has made a massive investment in its maritime forces, its air and naval forces. Turning itself from a country that really didn't have any capacity to fight at sea, or a country that had very big capacity to fight at sea. But there's a very significant feature of that. I don't want to give you sort of the Naval Strategy 101 lecture, but there are two kinds of things you can do at sea. One is you can try and project power yourself, and the other is you try and stop someone else projecting power. And what the Chinese have spent all their money on, and this is something I think about a lot because it's kind of choices, the kind of things that I worked on in Australian defence policy. The Chinese have spent a vast proportion of their money, not all of it, but a vast proportion of it, in building forces that can stop other people projecting power by sea, rather than building forces that allow them to project power by sea themselves. And that's very smart, because it's much easier, much more cost effective to prevent somebody else projecting power than trying to do it yourself. Now, the bad news is that means that they have built up a big capacity to stop America supporting, for example, Taiwan, or for that matter, the Philippines or other countries, if they find themselves in a conflict with China. But that's the bad news. The good news is that it makes it that China is still not at all well placed to project power by sea against other countries. Now that's no consolation if you're Vietnam, but it's a big consolation if you're Australia or for that matter the Philippines. Now that might change in future. The fact that Chinese are now, rather late in the piece, starting to invest in aircraft carriers suggests that that might change in future. But so far I still think the asymmetry is working our way. Will the Chinese nonetheless find a way forward to step back from behaving in the sort of very traditional great power way they've been behaving? I've been arguing that they've been behaving the last few years and are likely to behave in the next few years. I fear not. And that's partly because of, it seems to me, the Communist Party, although it has some very significant challenges, I still think does retain a very effective hold over the, so to speak, ideological life of China. And so the chances of other ways of thinking, including that kind of Sun Yat-sen model, of China's international identity, I think has got little chance of making much headway against the CCP. But I'd also make the point that I don't think it's just a Chinese Communist Party problem. What makes China ambitious strategically and makes it, as I would argue, so determined to change the regional order in its favour is not because it's communist, or even for that matter because it's Chinese. It's because it's normal. It's really just doing what every other rising power has done in history. Now, you don't want to be too fatalistic about these things, but you do, you look at the way, I mean, Britain, foggy, wet, rainy island off the coast of France, didn't account for anything very much in world affairs until, for some reason that people still don't understand, its economy took off like a rocket in the second half of the 18th century and turned into this power that could rule the world. And once they had that wealth, what did they do with it? Well, they set out, and apart from anything else, of course, dismantled the Chinese state through the Opium Wars and so on. And America did the same, Russia tried to do the same. I think we have to be very optimistic to imagine that if the Chinese acquire both the economic foundations and the military instruments to exercise greater influence, that they won't do with it as every other power has before. Sorry to be so gloomy.
I have a comment. I'm concerned that you expressed the situation that Australia and people of European descent might view the situation, that we've never been before in a situation where the greatest power in the world was Asian. I find that a quite dangerous formula. I don't understand why Asian is somehow or other a qualification we have to make. And I suggest that that's the kind of comment that actually gives rise to the sorts of opinions of Clive Hamilton, which in fact inevitably have rebounded on people in Australia, residents and citizens of Asian background. Having said all that, one of the things I'd actually like you to comment further, and you've done it to some extent talking about Asia and China as a sea power, is that what was called in some circles the Great Sea War of China, being Taiwan, Korea and Japan, were a clear threat to a country like Japan and like China, which is dependent upon the transport of goods for its wealth. So it seems to me that that was an inevitable development that it would make, that it would try and do something to address that power. What is interesting is how will Japan in particular respond to the great rise of China?
Yeah, no, really good question. Well, really good comment and really good question.
So B59 following purple, you have it precisely 10 seconds to get here, otherwise we're going to
That's distracting. Look, your point about, and let's, I think the point you raised is a very important one. The racial dimension of this issue is a very important one, and one that I think we're finding very hard to grapple with. And I think your reprimand, if I may use that word, is justified in some ways. Because the point I was really trying to make is that we have always been able to enjoy the fact that the most powerful country in the world was one with which we in Australia felt a very high level of comfort about their, there's a sort of formulation that you see in every Osman communique: history, culture, traditions, language, blah, blah, blah. And I mean, partly that's, diplomatic bullshit, but there is something there. I mean, why have we been as comfortable with living in an Asia dominated by Britain and America as we have been as a country? And I think something in that list, reflects that. So I think the real point is that almost you sort of turn the racial thing over. It's because these countries have been, or at least we have regarded them as being rather inaccurately, Anglo-Saxon, that we've been so comfortable with their power. And so I do think that's something we have to wrestle with. On Japan, that's a very important question. Japan faces a really serious challenge because, we're a bit anxious about China. No, we're very anxious about China. The Japanese are far, far more anxious, and they've got good reason to be. Both history and geography suggest that for Japan, living with powerful China is going to be really hard. And you know, the Treasury estimates that I mentioned before, the 42 to 24, poor old Japanese come in at 7. So 11 years from now, China's economy is 6 times the size of China's. Now, Japan therefore has, you know, a real choice to make. Ever since 1945, it's relied on America to protect it, and that's worked fine because America, you know, it's actually worked very well for Japan. But the less confident Japan can be that America will continue to play that role, the more the Japanese have to decide, ooh, what do we do? Now, there's huge resistance in Japan to returning to a traditional military role. But it's very hard for Japan to imagine what it's like to live next door to a China which it doesn't have much greater military capability than it has at the moment. So the dilemma it faces is whether, as US power fades, and the Japanese are very worried about that. I mean, if you give the sort of analysis that I've offered you here in audiences in Japan, which I've done pretty often, you see no one's better than the Japanese at facial expressions reflecting anxiety. You know, they really are worried about this. So what their choice is pretty simple. They could choose to return to being a great power, and I think Abe himself and the people around him actually quite like that idea. They could choose to become a kind of a middle power. That is, they look after themselves, but don't try and build a broader spread of influence. Or they could kind of choose to be a small power and just become, you know, this is my slightly impolite way of putting it, but there are no Canadians in the audience. It's a sort of Canada option. You know, it's like Canada lives next door to the United States and just accepts that that kind of puts a framework around them. They're a big country and very significant, I've always assumed that Japan was too focused on its own identity and so on, that it wouldn't accept that kind of small power model, that it wouldn't, so to speak, go quietly and accept Chinese preponderance. But some of my friends who know Japan much better than I do think that, particularly once Abe leaves the scene, because Abe's view doesn't really have much traction in Japan more generally, so the experts tell me, that it might just end up sort of, you know, going with the flow. And that's very significant for us, because if America ends up stepping back from the region, as I think the reasons I sketched is the most likely outcome, and Japan chooses not to try and oppose them, then the chances of the US, of China ending up as the dominant power in the region are much higher. Nobody else is going to stop them. And so, you know, I think that the way in which Japan's choices evolve over the next few years is going to be one of the really key things to watch.
Throw into the ring very quickly a sort of historical theoretical point,
Yes.
which we need to do if we're going to explain your very first point, that
Yep.
China has had the greatest
Yep.
development in human history, and why? So, very, very quickly, of course, China had a revolution. It was going to be building socialism, communism. We had Chinese Communist Party. I think, without going into great detail, around about the time of Tiananmen Square or whenever, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party decided if you can't beat them, join them.
Yep.
And there's been a massive increase of capitalist development in China, including billionaires being members of the Chinese Communist Party, which was not anathema previously.
Yes.
So I think, anyway, this is a lot of discussion in the left, in the Marxist movement, about the nature of the Chinese state and regime, and I think we do have, cut a long story short, the first ever actual state capitalist regime. Now, why is China able to escape what seems to afflict all the other capitalist powers in the world? Because they have state intervention on a conscious level. So my point is this, I don't want to get into a big discussion, but I think it's a huge discussion actually. I think we have now a hybrid regime, which is pointing in the direction of socialism.
Yes.
But, of course, it has very bureaucratic and dictatorial characteristics which must be changed if we're going to go to the next stage. But the key point is it's state capitalist, The United States is in total chaos.
Yeah.
The rest of the world capitalist system is in
Yep.
total chaos.
Yeah.
And the reason why China is going ahead is because they have that conscious leadership in the form of a party for all its
Yeah.
faults
Yeah.
and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And historically, I think that's critical.
Yeah. That's a. Yeah, it's an extraordinarily interesting point, sort of set of issues. And I, we could go on a lot about it, but I'll just make a couple of points. The first is that, in my shorthand way, the first thing that strikes me is that what the post-Deng Xiaoping China is, it's resolutely a Leninist system, got a very Leninist conception of the role of the party. But its economic model is, as you say, a mix of socialism and capitalism of a kind we've never seen before. And it really is true that the Chinese have invented their own model, and one of the reasons why China keeps on taking us by surprise is that we, probably not you, but the system as a whole tends to presume that the more open and liberalised the Chinese economy becomes, the better it's going to grow, and that just has kept on not happening. I've had a bazillion conversations over the last 30 years that I've been watching China. People saying, well, if only the Chinese can start opening up and free the entrepreneurial flair of the Chinese people from the crushing hand of the Chinese Communist Party, then their economy will grow. Hang on, what happened? Now, and one of the interesting questions is, well, how has this happened? And the first thing that we need to say is we just don't know. And it's very important when you don't understand something, you just say we don't understand that. That remains to be seen. But there's a couple of things which seem to be striking about the CCP as an institution compared to other highly authoritarian regimes, and it is a pretty authoritarian regime. The first is that it has proved unusually good, at least so far, this might be about to end, at leadership transition. I mean, the transition from Mao to the Gang of Four to Deng was very messy. But once Deng got in, he established the collective leadership and the rotational leadership model, and that worked very well right through the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and until last year when Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping changed it to his own advantage. Now we don't yet know whether it's going to produce chaos, but it certainly raised a question. But hitherto, compared to other similarly authoritarian regimes, it's proved to be an extremely good system of leadership transition, which is a very important part of any system. The second point is that unlike other highly authoritarian systems, including the dear old Communist Party of the Soviet Union, it proved very good at identifying problems, acknowledging problems. One of the things that's really made China stand up and dance is the fact that when something's not working, people tell Beijing it's not working, and somebody works out a solution to it. And the third thing is that the Chinese Communist Party does appear to be an astonishingly effective meritocracy. You don't get to the top of the CCP unless you're really good. Now they have the advantage that they have a membership base of whatever it is, 30 million people. But from those 30 million people, they cascade people up through the hierarchy in an extremely effective way. And it's a very and again, compared to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, for example, where you did end up with some pretty mediocre people in pretty senior jobs, particularly towards the end. In the Chinese system, you've got to be good to flourish, and so one of the results of that is that in some ways, just looking at the numbers, and not for a moment denying that there's some very bad things happen in China, it has been, sort of from an abstract policymaker's point of view, it's been one of the most effective governments the world's ever seen. The capacity to develop good policies, that is policies which achieve its objectives, and then implement those across a very broad and complex country, has been remarkable. And one of the reasons why people keep on underestimating China is they keep on underestimating the capacity of that system to identify problems, come up with solutions and implement them. Now that's not to say they'll keep on doing it forever, but it is to say they've proved to be much better than people had expected.
Sort of take you back to the 7th century. I guess one reason I'm doing this is that I feel it's really, really important to have that sort of longer view. And of course, in the 7th century, China was, as it had been for the previous few thousand years, the number one power in the world. Now, whenever somebody says Belt and Road, I immediately think of the Buddhist monk Swan Sung traipsing along the Silk Road and going down into India and coming back with camel
With a whole new idea.
of Buddhist sutras.
Right.
Now, that also leads me to ask, to what extent is China's thinking now driven by the consciousness of how things were then? And it would be astonishing if it were not driven by that. And to what extent can China learn from the soft power that it undoubtedly enjoyed back then?
No, really. No, look, it's a really good question. I mean, I think, well, a couple of points. The first is, what you say is true of the 7th century, but it was also true of the 18th century, when China was the world's biggest economy until about 1800. And what displaced it was the fact that, until about 1800, well, at least until the latter half of the 18th century, per capita productivity was just about the same in every country in the world. And so, GDP is a simple sum. How much work output does each worker produce times how many workers there are. So your GDP is proportionate to your population. And then the British did something which nobody still really understands, and produced this astonishing increase in per capita output. And so 12 million Brits, as it then was, ended up with more output than 300 million Chinese, as it then was. And that is what changed the world. That's what produced the world as we've known it, the West versus the rest and all of that. And so at one very important level, this is just returning to normal. That the relationship, that we've had an unusual episode in history where some countries have had much higher per capita productivity than others. And what's happened in China since 1979 is China's Industrial Revolution. And you've been quite precise about that. What's happened in China since 1979 is what happened in England or in Britain from the middle of the 18th century through to the middle of the 19th century. People leaving semi-subsistence or handicraft jobs where their average output was $2 a day, to factory jobs where their average output was $20 a day in contemporary terms. A tenfold increase in daily output in the time it takes to move from the farm to the factory, from some field in Lincolnshire to the first dark satanic mill in Birmingham. And all of those people moving out of villages, people whose parents were peasants moving into factories in the Pearl River Delta, have just been doing what our English ancestors did in the 18th and 19th century. So it's one of the things about this is so normal. This is just, the only thing that's different about China is the scale. So, that's that. Second point is, as the Chinese contemplate this, I'm sure you're right, and I should stress, I don't have personal access to this because I only speak to Chinese about this stuff in English, and that's not the way that. But some of my friends and colleagues who are very deep scholars of China and know China very well, do make the point that, of course, for them, their astonishing history is a real touchstone and they think about what's going ahead. And it works in several different ways. If you're Chinese, and not just if you're worth bearing in mind, if you're a Chinese of my age, born in 1953, went to university in 1970, had rather a protracted university career, joined the workforce in 1980. So if you're a Chinese who's my contemporary, you remember the Great Famine. And statistically speaking, you probably lost siblings, or parents, or close relatives, of starvation. And knowing what it means to watch a sibling die of starvation, and this is just my age, let alone the people who are older still. The second thing is, of course, you remember the Cultural Revolution. If you're my age, you're probably out on the streets. you might have been throwing people out the windows. You might have been thrown out the window yourself. You had a very good chance of having been sent down to the pig farm. And then, of course, there's no universities. So when I went to university, the universities in China were closed. And then they were reopened in the mid-70s. Vast rush of people into the Chinese university system. And many of them came out in about 1979 and 1980, just when Deng Xiaoping was working the change. And from there, so, you know, I started work, Commonwealth Public Service, March 1980, when China's economy was, I think, you know, $220 ahead or something. So in my own professional lifetime, you've seen all of this growth. And so what do you have? Well, you have a very strong sense, of course, of China's extraordinary history. And of course that affects the way they think about things. But you also have a very strong sense of the century of humiliation. I mean, we better believe they take that seriously. They have a very strong sense of their astonishing achievements of their generation and how proud must they be of that. And they have a great deal of confidence about their future. They're not complacent about it, they have a lot of confidence in it. You know, past greatness, recent humiliation, current achievements, future glory. Psychologically, it's a very powerful thing. Now, are they going to be inclined to think, well, let's just soft power this? Ooh, well, I wouldn't bet on it. I mean, one of the slightly, this is a slightly uncomfortable thing to say, but although we all like soft power, it tends to be the soft power is what people talk about when the hard power is going out the window. And I think there are very few examples in history of countries using soft power when the hard power is available. Now, I think that China is not unconscious of these things, but I still think if it comes to a toss-up between coming to Australia, for example, and saying, well, we'd rather you didn't do that, and if you do, we're going to cut off the flow of students to your universities or the flow of tourists to your tourist resorts, they're more likely to do that than to say, please don't do what you're going to do that we don't want you to do because of the glories of Confucianism. I think that, it's, and in the end, it's worth bearing in mind, we talk a lot about soft power, but, you know, when America wants to change Iran's mind, what does it do?
Bomb them and the Iranians make the opposite decision to that which the United States.
Yes. Of course, Iranians have their own view.
Everybody else in the room might know the answer to this question, but you spoke about America being the primary power in the Pacific, in this region. Why? Why do they need to be that, or why do they want to be that?
Yeah, no, really. No, so it's a really good question. I mean, sorry. Yes. It's a really good question, and I mean, lots of different ways to approach it. But in some ways, the most pertinent way, how does it look from Washington, and how does it look from Iowa and Wisconsin and places? So if you're an American, and I'm trying to persuade you to bear any burden and pay any price to preserve America's leadership in the Western Pacific, you say, well, why do I want that? And I actually think this is an absolutely core question, because it's easy to convince a room of experts and think tankers in Washington that America must do that. It seems to be much harder to persuade a group of Americans. So you ask yourself, well, how has America done this in the past? How in the past did American policy elites convince Americans at large to do the sorts of things that America did in the 20th century? First World War, Second World War, Cold War in particular. And the answer actually is pretty simple. I mean, there's all this stuff about, I'm not going to portray my methodological prejudices here. There's all the stuff about, freedom and democracy and all the rest of it. But I do tend to think that that's their kind of, surface phenomenon. The really deep reason why America did it is because they believed, and let's just focus on the Cold War, I think you can say the same thing about the earlier conflicts. Americans were prepared to pay immense price to prevent the Soviet Union dominating other parts of the world, because they feared that if the Soviets did, they'd threaten America at home in the Western Hemisphere. Now, you can have an interesting debate as to whether they're right about that or not, but I think it's pretty clear that that's what Americans believed. And so, in order to persuade Americans that they need to remain the dominant power in East Asia, you have to persuade Americans that if China becomes the dominant power in East Asia, they'll be able to threaten America at home in the Western Hemisphere. But that's why I think it's very important to make the point that I made in my earlier remarks about the difference between China wanting to rule the world and China wanting to dominate East Asia. I easily buy the argument that China wants to dominate East Asia, but I don't think it wants to rule the world. And if it just dominates East Asia, it's not going to be powerful enough to threaten the United States, because it's going to be all sorts of, I mean, it's going to be India. And, you know, the Indians, you know, never quite live up to our hopes for them, but it's still, you know, it's a billion and a bit very talented people, and even only growing at 5% per annum, big debate about how fast India's growing at the moment, but even if they're only growing at 5% per annum, they will approach China, you know, over the coming decades. It will be a very formidable rival to China. Then there's Russia. Now Russia's, you know, sort of complicated story, but it's still got 5,000 nukes. You know, and think about Upper Volta with nuclear weapons is that it's still got nuclear weapons, and it gives you a certain amount of influence. And then there's Europe. Now Europe's hard to take seriously strategically, but that's really because they don't try. But it's always worth remembering that Europe is the world's biggest economy, and it has a population of 600 million people, which is not China, but it's pretty big, and it has phenomenal depths of technology. If they chose to be, and if they acted together, the Europeans would be very formidable strategically, and there's still America. None of my analysis says that America is going to disappear. It's going to be the world's third biggest economy, because it's got the world's third biggest population. And so all of those things say it's not going to be what the Soviet Union threatened to be, for example. And so I don't think Americans are going to be persuaded that they have to prevent China dominating East Asia in order to prevent China threatening America. And therefore I don't think they're going to be willing to bear the burdens and pay the prices required to do so. We'll see.
Firstly, the CIA up until the 1990s used to monitor in order to understand the GDP of a nation, they used to look at various resources, in particular sulfuric acid, to get an idea of the potential for growth or where they're at.
Yeah.
But as the manufacturing base in the West moved over to the East, in particular China, that model sort of actually collapsed. Now, first question is, would monitoring natural resources in China, for example, the rare earth metals today, or access to arable land, would that be a means of actually understanding China in a different way that will actually be a lot better at understanding, even for themselves abroad and foreigners, where they're heading?
Yeah.
And secondly, in the case of both the Americans and the Chinese, but also for the rest of the world, it is said that apparently by 2030, China may run out of potable water due to pollution.
Yeah.
My question is, will climate change be a catalyst for changing the hegemony of the future, independent of how their plans are, and the old strategy idea of no matter what your plans are, when war starts, everything gets thrown out? So if you could give us a comment on that, thank you.
Yes. Really good set of questions. Let me start with the last point, and that is you're absolutely right. You know, wars always have lots of unpleasant surprises for everyone. Nothing ever goes according to plan. But the point is it's symmetrical. And one of the lessons of history is that the country that everyone assumes is the bee's knees often ends up doing worse than people expect. And the country that people think is coming up from behind often does better than people expect. And partly because of institutional complacency. Now I do think I wouldn't want to overstate this, but I think people just keep on saying the United States has the world's strongest and most capable military. Well, it's the biggest in some levels, and there are some things it can do that nobody else can do, but that's not the right measure. What matters in this context is what can you do where it counts. And the United States has to project power by sea into the Western Pacific, and China just have to stop them. It's a very asymmetrical contest. All the asymmetries will play out China's way. And the Chinese are lean and hungry and not hidebound. So America keeps on investing billions and billions of dollars in aircraft carriers, whereas even everyone in the US Navy knows that they're just career opportunities for ambitious young Chinese submarine commanders. or missile commanders. You know, this is a major waste of money. I mean, you know, sometimes militaries get something radically wrong, and this is one such example. So, you know, don't get me started on that. But look, on the question of how you measure China's GDP, this has been a long-running story, and I'm neither a China expert nor an economist, so I just defer to my colleagues on this. But way back in the 90s, when people were saying, I remember when I was working in government, people were saying, we don't believe these GDP figures. You know, the Communist Party was announcing 10.7% GDP growth, and people said, no, that can't be right. And so quite a lot of work was done in looking at how you can, as you say, how you can get behind the numbers. And again, not my field, but the method, some really critical things was engineering. It was electricity generation capability, consumption of coal, consumption of iron ore, and so on. And a lot of work was done at ANU on this, and all of the work concluded that the GDP numbers were, broadly speaking, right. And everything, looking back now from what we now know, it's clear that that was right. And the Chinese economy has become more transparent since, not necessarily because the CCP has developed a great commitment to openness, but just because it trades so much. We know so much about its inputs. There's a lot to be learned about. We're going to open to having conversations with Americans a long time ago, where you know, a lot of my debates with Americans have been Americans saying I was too optimistic about China and too pessimistic about America, and the Chinese economy wasn't nearly as big as it made out to be. I had a very, very senior figure in the US economic firmament, frighteningly senior and prominent, say to me across a seminar room table, Professor White, you know, you've got to understand the Chinese economy is just a pyramid scheme. And I said, well, Professor, it's a pyramid scheme which is buying 1 million tonnes of iron ore a day from Australia. 1 million, and I don't know what they're doing with it, they're not eating it. So they must be doing something with it. And that suggests they've got a bit of an economy running there, not a pyramid scheme. Anyway, I do think people are now reasonably confident that the statistics we're getting, I don't doubt for a moment that they're nudged up and down 0.5% or 1%. But the idea that the Chinese economy is growing roughly speaking at 6% per annum these days, that seems to be borne out by all the other data. So I think we're reasonably clear on that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, climate change. Absolutely. Sorry. Absolutely. No, really, really important. Look, there's a couple of points to make about that. The first is, you know, we just step back from the conversation we've been having and make the point that, you know, what all this means, amongst other things, particularly if you bring India into the picture, is that there's another 2.5 billion people, well, plus the Vietnamese and so on, and the Indonesians, heading for lifestyles like ours, heading for consumption like ours. So on top of everything we know right now about climate change and all the rest of it, the question we ask ourselves is, can the Earth sustain another 2.5 or 3 or 4 billion people living just the way we live? And just the way we live, that's the point. I mean, you know, it's important to understand how like our lives, the lives of average Chinese people are. I mean, I'm not widely travelled in China at all, but there's one city I go to quite often called Changsha. Probably none of you have ever heard of Changsha. No reason why you should. It's the 19th biggest city in China, 7 million people. And you go down to downtown Changsha on a Friday night with your students, and it's like Times Square. It just booms. And what is it? Millions of, you know, young Chinese out there having a great time. And you just think, this is just Changsha. I mean, oh my God, it's Changsha. So what that means for the resource demand on the Earth is something which we still haven't come to terms with. Now, you know, luckily so far in the Pilbara there's enough iron ore to do what's required. But, you know, the broader question, and of course climate change is absolutely central to that, but I think we need to look a bit more broadly than that, and water is obviously really central to this. And the real answer is I have no idea. It's obviously going to be immensely demanding, but I would make the point that, and this is very suspect piece of methodology. I remember in the 1990s, when I was still in government, having serious discussions about whether water supply problems would inhibit China's economic growth over the forthcoming decade. And what happened instead was the Chinese did an awful lot of things to work their way around the problems. Now, that's not the fact that they did it last time doesn't mean they can do it next time. But one thing goes back to the point I made about the CCP. They do understand they have a problem, and the same with climate change actually. I mean, the Chinese do understand. Chinese system understands climate change as a problem much better than our system, for example. And so it may get in the way. It may be an inhibition. It may even be a catastrophe. But I wouldn't. My main point from the point of the analysis of what it means for Australia, I wouldn't rely on that as a factor which will stop China growing. The other point I make is that the escalating rivalry between the US and China, the fact that the rivalry has become so overt, the talk of the new Cold War, makes the prospect for cooperation between the US and China on things like climate change much lower. This has very significant strategic implications. It's got very significant implications in environmental policy, in economic policy. Imagine if the global financial crisis happened today and how the US and China would cooperate. Well, they just wouldn't. And China will be even more important the next time round than it was last time round because its economy is a relatively larger share of the global economy.
Let's see, you're saying that population rather than their productivity. You're nodding. Now, the other thing about Trump, now, you've sort of said that Trump's a little bit different to the institutions, but I guess my question is, to what extent is Trump a loose cannon or an independent player? To what extent is he channeling the US military establishment or some sort of thing out there outside of Trump? Now, as far as Australia goes and Chinese soft power, on the one hand I think it's a legitimate concern, but when you look at the US, they're doing a lot more than just their ambassador talking to our Minister for Foreign Affairs. They are infiltrating our institutions in a way that I suggest is overreach by an ally. And so I suppose as far as soft power goes, you also have the Chinese Silk Road initiative that maybe you want to say something about. And lastly, I won't compliment you on your speech because I'm sure everyone else can do that.
Okay, a lot in that. Thank you for the last remark. Look, I'm not an economist, and I keep on saying that because it's true. So I just rely on what economists tell me, if you know what I mean. But one of the really interesting things about the Chinese economy is that, it had this massive wodge of per capita productivity growth as people move from very low productivity jobs into medium productivity jobs in reasonably low capitalised industrial concerns. And one of the big questions is whether China can get through that and move into the even higher productivity that you expect in a more advanced economy, this whole middle income trap thing. Now, a lot of people argued for a long time that China was destined for the middle income trap and that its GDP growth would slow because its per capita productivity could not keep increasing, and of course the population workforce is actually declining. But that was based, as far as I can see, on models of what happens to per capita productivity in the later stages of an industrial revolution, which presuppose that China did what most other countries have done, and that is moved, right at the heart of industrial revolution is education. In the first phase you have to have primary education, so people can read and write, and then you have to have secondary education, so people can do more than just read and write, do calculations, and then you need tertiary education. And so in order for China to avoid the middle income trap, it had to do something which most people thought was impossible, and that is move just a couple of decades after the whole process began from primary education to secondary education to very broad-based tertiary education. And the thing the Chinese have done have engineered, amongst other things, the biggest increase in tertiary education the world has ever seen by an order of magnitude, and that's not an exaggeration. Now, of course, a lot of the quality of the education, because some of that, of course, is done by sending students here, but the students that have come to Australia and the United States is a tiny fraction of the number of first-generation tertiary students in China in the last decade or so. they have been built, I forget that, it's some ridiculous figure, they've built a, 40,000 student, opened a 40,000 student undergraduate student university every 3 days. I mean, it's not, maybe not 3 days, but it's a phenomenal number. And so they have, and these are probably pretty crappy universities, but then again, when America started building, there's a famous story about people in the Oxford Common Room saying, oh, I understand they've got a university in Chicago these days. I wonder what they teach, pig slaughtering. Well, first, the University of Chicago was probably pretty crappy, but within a few decades it was one of the best universities in the world. So there were universities opening up in little cities in China, which today are probably pretty lousy, little cities like Changsha, which today are probably pretty lousy, but will get better in all probability, and if they can do that, then what we'll see is, and what we are seeing, is a surprisingly rapid move through the middle income into the upper income levels of per capita productivity. So, so although I nodded at your question, I'm not actually sure that's what's going to happen. Sorry, what was your second?
Well, the Chinese Silk Road Initiative
Oh, yes.
another one, and the other
Yes.
one's about Trump as well.
Yes.
Whether Trump's independent or challenged.
Look, I don't think the Silk Road and Belt and Road Initiative, all of that, I don't think that's going to be as significant as a lot of other people do, either as a positive or a negative. A lot of people see it as a very sinister piece of, sort of Chinese grand planning aiming to take over the world. I think it's a bit of smoke and mirrors. It's got a lot of political profile in China itself, but I don't think people are going to look back in 20 years' time and say that's what really made the difference. What really makes the difference is the sheer scale of the Chinese economy. The fact that even at growing at 6% per annum, it adds such massive annually that its demand for imports and its capacity to export increases so massively every year. And particularly as its own domestic consumption grows, its demand for imports means that it will remain, as it is today, the most important source of future economic opportunities for almost every country in the world. And that's if you want to see where China's soft power comes from, that's the real thing. Why do Australian governments obsess about China? It's not just because they lift 1 million and a bit tons of iron ore off our coast every day, or they send all those students and tourists today. That's important. But when we think about our economic future, it's the scale of China's future demand, which means that it is the primary source of future economic opportunities for us if we can exploit them. And we desperately want to be part of that, and that's true of everybody else as well. Now, Trump, this is a big subject. He's different. I read, a lot of people say the big thing about Trump is he's unpredictable. I actually think the interesting thing about Trump is how predictable and consistent he is. And one thing that's really consistent about Trump is that he doesn't believe in American leadership. It goes back to the question we talked about before about why would Americans want to lead in East Asia. He doesn't. He's never bought that argument. And this makes him completely different from everybody else or everybody in the US sort of policy establishment. Sorry?
Inward looking.
Well, yes, inward look. I mean, yes, absolutely. I mean, it's, the old phrase is isolationist. And that's right. Trump just doesn't think that America's welfare depends very much on what happens elsewhere in the world. And I mean, he overstates it. I mean, he has a model for America's economy which is virtually autarkic. He just wants the US economy to work by itself. But strategically, he's just never bought the argument that you need to pay the costs and bear the burdens of global leadership in order to keep Americans safe. And he's been very consistent on this. In 1986 or 7, he took out a full-page advertisement when he was just a budding real estate tycoon. He took out a full-page advertisement in the New York Times in which he said we should abandon our alliances with these Europeans and the Asians. We don't care whether they're overtaken by communism or not. What matters is they're ripping us off economically. He says the same thing today. And over the last 18 months, as Washington as a whole, right up to and including the Vice President, have been talking up America's strategic contest with China, the strategic contest with China, Trump has not said a word. He has never spoken of America having a strategic contest with China. He talks about the economic contest all the time. He doesn't talk about a strategic contest. So one of the reasons why I think the chance of America really gearing itself up to to contest China's bid for leadership in East Asia is that I don't think Trump actually cares a damn about it. And you can see there's quite a lot of evidence that his people keep on trying to gee him up to give the big speech in which he sort of declares that China's a strategic rival. He just won't do it. He just won't say it. And in doing that, I think he's, as perhaps in other ways, genuinely reflecting the country he's leading.
Okay, sounds like you're saying he's a loose cannon compared to the establishment.
Yeah, and the fact is that the establishment keeps on, and this is the point, that inside Washington, everybody at both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, you couldn't put a cigarette paper between John McCain and Hillary Clinton on their basic view of America's position in the world. And Donald Trump just doesn't share it. But the interesting thing is, we've got a Melbourne Cup field of contenders for the Democrat nomination. They're up studying their stuff in Miami last night, or this night. And I'm tracking a little bit what they all say about foreign policy. It doesn't take me long, because they hardly ever talk about it. And when they do, none of them talk about US leadership. And that's called a code word, leadership. US leadership is a kind of code word in American political discourse. And they just don't talk about it. They're just not interested in it. They're interested in labour standards, they're interested in things that relate to America's domestic economy. They're not interested in the idea of America leading the world. So I think Trump actually, in that respect, of course he could do terribly erratic things. I mean, my sort of one-liner is, Trump might very well start a war with China because Xi Jinping has offended him personally, but he won't start a war with China because he wants to preserve American leadership in Asia.
We've actually run out of time.
Yes.
We've got two more questions.
Being Filipino
Yeah.
quite upset over it.
Yeah.
Is it because of fish? I heard one theory fish. I heard another theory that they're going to lick the islands as a submarine net and that the subs can't get close.
Yeah.
And one more question, just and not too long, you've got to go, is what's your view on sort of North Korea? I've always had a view that North Korea is like a bit of a puppet controlled by China.
Yeah.
And I noticed, when there's sort of something going on between America, suddenly North Korea launches this missile. I'm wondering whether the Premier of China brings up the North Koreans and goes, oh look, shoot one of these missiles off we, because the Americans are, just a theory and an outlet.
Let me give you quick answers on those. Look, on what's happening in the South China Sea, I take a slightly different view of that than everyone else. Of course, there are questions about resources, fisheries, and there's the sort of national pride thing of just, they're our territory even if they're totally useless, so we want to hang on to them. But if you ask yourself, why are we talking about the South China Sea? Why has the South China Sea become this big issue? I think it's because both the United States and China have chosen to use it as the issue upon which they'll test one another on their leadership. Because the way in which, if you're a rising power trying to assert your leadership against an established power, or if you're an established power trying to assert your leadership against an ambitious rising power, what you need to do is to create opportunities where your adversary tries to do something and you stop them. So I'm in charge, I'm going to stop you doing it, or you do that to me. And so what's happened in the South China Sea is that the Americans thought, there's all the law of the sea stuff and all the rest of it, but why did they put such a big thing on it? Because they thought, here's our chance. The Chinese are doing this stuff. We are going to tell them to stop doing it. And when they back off, then we'll look strong and they'll look weak. There's something wrong with that theory. The Chinese had thought, here's a chance. The Americans are going to say we can't do something, and we're going to do it. And that'll make them look weak. Now, the fact is that as it's played out, the Chinese were right and the Americans were wrong. When push came to shove it, this is what happened. The Americans found themselves watching the Chinese doing things which the Americans had said you must not do. So the Americans then had to ask, well, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to sail our ships in and sort of risk a clash? And it went all the way up to Obama, and Obama said, you're kidding. I'm going to risk a clash with China and undermine my prospects of getting a climate change deal with them over some pointless uninhabitable rock or reef in the South China Sea. It's not that important. And so, it's a classic great power play. There's lots of examples through history of tiny little trivial issues being used as a kind of a, status meter for competing great powers. That's exactly what happened at the beginning of the Peloponnesian Wars in the 5th century. Look, North Korea, big subject. I take a different view. I think North Korea is a sort of a power unto itself. For a long time, one of my jobs was to manage the defence relationship with Papua New Guinea. And people used to keep on saying to us, Americans, for example, would say to us, look, how come you guys can't just tell the Papua New Guineans what to do? You're the biggest aid donor. And I said, well, go to Port Moresby one day and give it a try, mate. And the fact is, I think, the North Koreans are very good at, they're very skilled at statecraft. They haven't got much to go on, but they've been extremely good at maximising what it is, and they have been, I'm very sorry that they've developed nuclear weapons, but I can understand why they've done it. Remember who their neighbours are. Sorry? Well, yeah, exactly. These are all countries that have nuclear armed states on their borders. China, Russia. Sorry?
Aggressive ones.
Yes, aggressive ones. So it's not that surprising. And so I think, but I do think something very interesting has happened in North Korea in the last 18 months. Once they had the nuclear capability and they were confident that it was going to work, I think Kim, and remember Kim is very young, so he's interested not in what happens this year or next year, he's interested in making sure he doesn't end up like the poor old Ceausescu who's up against the wall with the AK, or in the case of North Korea, the anti-aircraft guns, 30 or 40 years from now. And I think he's reached the decision that now that he's got the nuclear weapons, he can afford to start looking for a deal with South Korea. Now, it's a long and rocky road, but I think the South Koreans have reached the same conclusion. And just to draw a line under that, I think we're well and truly down a track which leads towards a rapprochement on the Korean Peninsula, with North Korea not abandoning its nuclear weapons, which leads to a reduction, if not a complete elimination of the US strategic position on the Korean Peninsula, which is a win for China. And a disaster for Japan, and raises the question about Japan we talked about before. I better stop.